In this video segment, I'm going to talk about Standard 5.1, which addresses universal required competencies. I'm going to explain what they are, why they're so important, and what your program's responsibilities are with respect to this standard. You can pause the videos at any time and look more closely, and I highly recommend that you download the slides to read the accompanying notes as they contain more details than I can present in a short video clip. The videos are never intended to be a substitute for attending the Accreditation Institute. So please plan to send at least one representative of your program to the AI, the Accreditation Institute, where we'll have the opportunity to practice and apply some of the concepts from this and other video segments. So, what are the universal competencies? In developing the accreditation standards, the Standards Committee and ultimately the members of NASPAA identified five broad areas in which we think graduates of any accredited program, whether it's an MPA or an MPP, whether it's in a metropolitan area or in a small community, whether it's in the US or another country, they should be preparing students in these five areas to lead and manage in public governance, to participate in and contribute to the policy process, to analyze, synthesize, think critically, solve problems, and make decisions, to articulate and apply a public service perspective, and finally, to communicate and interact productively with a diverse and changing workforce and citizenry. A graduate of any accredited program, NASPAA accredited program, should have the ability to do these things. But what these precisely mean varies in the context of any program's mission. And so it's your responsibility within your program to define what these mean, given your mission. So for example, take a moment and imagine two very different program missions. One is an executive education program for local government leaders who have worked in their profession for more than 15 years. And another is a pre-service program that has almost exclusively students coming straight out of an undergraduate program who may have only had a part-time internship as an undergraduate student, and that's the extent of their work experience. You can imagine that those two programs would define leading and managing in public governance differently. That the expectations for the competencies of leadership of the executive ed students would be different than those for the pre-service students. Similarly, a program based in a largely homogeneous, in terms of demographics, community in the United States might define interacting and working productively and effectively with a diverse and changing workforce and citizenry a little bit differently than a program that is based in a large metropolitan area with considerable diversity or based outside of the United States. The fundamental principle here is that COPRA is not telling you how you have to define these, but it is telling you that you have to define them, and you have to define them in the context of your own mission. Let's take a look at some samples of competency definitions, not necessarily connected to these five areas, but just to see how to define a competency. So first, the fundamental question we're asking is, what are your students able to do when they complete your degree program? One option, our graduates will be creative city managers. What does that mean? What does it mean to be creative? I understand city manager, but what does it mean to be creative? Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that means? So that first sample in red would probably raise a red flag with COPRA. The second version of that in green gives us a little bit more to work with. It's a little bit more clear and precise. Our graduates will be able to set goals, design programs, manage competing stakeholder interests, and obtain resources to improve municipal services. Yes, I elaborated a little bit on that. But the idea is that you give enough detail in your definition of a competency that you'd actually be able to measure it. Because the first one is so vague, as are the general definitions of the universal competencies, that they're really not measurable. Let me give you another example. Again, in red, a very general, vague description of what you'd like your students to be able to do, followed by a clarification, more detail, more precise. Now, both of these are at the program level. Both of these examples talk about competencies at the program level. And ultimately, that's what you want to get at. That is what accreditation is about. It's assessing program level performance. And universal competencies, standard 5.1, are assessing what the students know and are able to do at the end of the program as a whole. But it might be easier to start out by thinking about what competencies do you expect students to have after they complete each individual class within your program. So this next slide is an example of that. You might ask yourselves, what do we expect our students to be able to do? What competencies should they have after they complete our course on budgeting? And again, you have the red flag example that's a little too vague and a clarified, more precise wording. It's not intended that any program take these examples and copy them and use them, but they're simply to illustrate the level of detail that is helpful in defining competencies. And you would do this for every course within your program. And each course would probably have multiple competencies, multiple things, 2, 3, 5 things that you expect your students to be able to do at the end of each course. And that might be a useful way to start. And in fact, it feeds very well into the development of a curriculum map or a curriculum matrix, which is also a requirement and a useful tool. So this slide provides a graphic representation of the process to develop a curriculum map or a curriculum matrix. There are a variety of ways in which you can do this. They should, again, as with all processes that we expect, or COPRA expects that you use, they should engage relevant stakeholders. This should not be a single individual sitting in his or her office deciding how to map the curriculum against the competencies. But COPRA doesn't specify a precise process, nor does it specify a particular format. But the general idea is you are mapping or creating a matrix between your courses and your competencies. So this might look like in the rows in a table, you identify the 5 universal competencies. In the columns, you identify knowledge, skills, and abilities related to each of those competencies. And in each cell, which is the intersection of those rows and columns, you list the classes in which those things are addressed. That could be one form of a curriculum map. Another might have, again, on the rows, each of the universal competencies as you've defined them for your program in the context of your mission, and in the columns, each of your classes that are required within your program. And then in the individual cells, you might just have a little check mark to indicate, yes, in this class, we address this competency. And then you leave the cell blank if in that class you don't address that competency. If you want to be a little bit more sophisticated, instead of just putting a check mark, you could indicate whether that competency is first being introduced in a particular class, and or is it being practiced, and or is it being assessed. So you might put those words or symbols or letters to represent introduction, practice, and assessment. There are lots of formats for what a curriculum map or a curriculum matrix might look like. The idea here is that you are looking to see that your curriculum adequately addresses all of the competencies that you have identified as important for your mission. So, what else do you have to do besides define these and map them relative to your curriculum? Well, there is this concept of a full assessment cycle. A full assessment cycle encompasses 4 steps: definition of the competency in the context of your mission, determining when and how you will measure it, each competency, collecting the information, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. You need to collect some data, collect some information, and then finally analyzing it, interpreting it, and using it to answer the question, are students acquiring the competencies that we expect of them? And ultimately, that is part of answering the question, are we achieving our mission? There are many ways to measure competencies and whether students have them. This table provides a list, not an exhaustive list, but a list of many different possible ways you can measure student learning and whether they have the desired competencies. There are direct measures where you're actually observing and getting that information about student performance, and indirect measures where you're asking someone, the student or some other person, to evaluate the student's competencies in those areas. The idea is not that you will pick one of these and use it for everything, or that you will use all of them, but instead you will select measures that make sense given what competency you're trying to measure and given your mission, and that you'll have a holistic or comprehensive approach that will rely on a combination of measures, but all of which are valid and reliable. Those are the key concepts when you're selecting measures for those learning outcomes or those competencies. Because of our concern for validity and reliability, many programs opt to use rubrics. Rubrics have the advantage of providing some inter-rater reliability, because if there are multiple evaluators, they have some guidelines as to how to determine whether a student is demonstrating that competency at a particular level. They also provide the basis for evaluating validity, because you can fill in those rubric cells with descriptions that really do get at that competency you're trying to measure. So on this slide, there's an example, a very basic example of some components that might be part of a rubric for a capstone project. And you can pause the video and look more carefully at how that rubric is established. Another very important aspect of assessment in the context of Standard 5.1 or assessment in general is sustainability. You need to have a plan, and this is part of your self-study report, is to present your assessment plan. How are you going to measure and gather data and analyze that data and use it on a regular basis? But part of that plan for assessment is considering, how do we make this sustainable? How do we make this something that we will continue? Part of that may be that you'll be cycling through those universal competencies and not measuring each one or not analyzing the data from each one every year. So you spread this out over time and you put into your plan what that cycle is. It might also be that you look for ways to measure that are already part of your program, or look for opportunities or places, times to measure that are already part of your program. You don't have to create an entirely new assessment process. Some things might already exist within your program. If you have a capstone or other culminating experience, if you ask for feedback from the internship supervisors, those are opportunities to assess competencies, and you can take advantage of them. So sustainability is a really important part of what you build into your plan. You don't want this to become overly burdensome. Remember, this isn't just about accreditation. This is ultimately about improving the quality of public service.